Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to share our second session on case making for evidence-based teaching and student-centered instruction with you. Today's session will be interactive, where we work to connect vital data and strategies with your experiences at your institutions. We encourage you to respond to questions and comments in the chat, but to help keep us and our discussion on track and on time, we also have a parking lot for today's meeting for thoughts, questions, or comments that we can respond to at a later time. And the link to that parking lot is going to be put into the chat now, and we'll post it again later in case you didn't catch it. We will be working together over the course of this series and discussing important and challenging ideas to help you make a strong case within your institution. It's vital to build community so we can do that work well. If you are able, we are inviting you to turn on your camera. So to get started, we are going to hand it over to your facilitators for today's session, Dr. Tanya Scott and Dr. Trent Moorbutter. Take it away.
Hi there.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate it. Hey, everyone, it's great to be back with you. See some familiar faces and names on the gallery as again. For those that are new this time, I am Trent Moorbutter, as Norma said. I'm celebrating my 31st year as an educator. I spent time in K-12 and most recently the bulk of the last 10 years or so in higher ed as the Vice President for Instruction and Chief Academic Officer at Nash Community College here in Eastern North Carolina. Digging into this work, I've spent the last couple of years actually facilitating professional learning, mostly in the virtual space, as we have all spent most of our time in the virtual space. Because I think back to like the work that we do in the college space, I have to think about my own time in college and think about, overcoming some obstacles along the way. I was a first-gen student. My parents always told me that I would go to college, though we had no plan and no real idea on how that was going to happen. So it was quite an adventure. But I do remember getting into my first education course. I was an education major in biology and physical education. And I remember getting an opportunity for the first time to get in front of students and how exciting that was. And that excitement about just teaching and learning at the heart of seeing students now of any age, whether they're seventh graders, where I cut my teeth in middle school math and science, or whether they're college students, seeing those light bulb moments is so exciting. And I reflect back to that, Tanya, and think about how exciting that was the first time to be able to be in front of students. I'm sure you've got a fun story or memory with your college life as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Trent. Yep. For those of you who are just joining us today, my name is Tanya Scott. I'm the Associate Director for Teaching and Learning at Achieving the Dream. It's such a pleasure to meet you all here today. And like Trent, I'm also a first-gen college student, college graduate. And what was most deeply impactful to me in my academic career as a student was after completing my bachelor's degree, I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to go quite yet. And so I took some courses, and one of them was called The Nature and Function of Teaching. And that course was so deeply impactful to me. It really asked me to reflect on my own education, my own educational experiences, and really drew out really what wound up being a love for teaching for myself as well. And I've brought that to my career, over 20 years in higher ed as well. I've been in the 4-year as well as community college space in a variety of roles, but all throughout my career I've taught, and I still continue to teach as well. And it's such a pleasure to be amongst peers, talking through how we could better our classrooms and ultimately reach our students most effectively. So we're going to anchor ourselves in our session agreements. We're going to revisit these, and we did go through these last session last week, and we'll just talk through these again. And of course, if you have any ideas or recommendations on any agreements we would like to add to this list, please go ahead and put that in the chat, but let's read these together. We will listen attentively, which means we'll listen without thinking how you will respond. So we're going to practice our active listening skills. We will bring our truth and speak our truth to this session and every session following this. So we'll use I statements, recognize the perspective you are bringing, and validate differing perspectives. We'll also take risks outside of your comfort zone, and we'll ask you to lean into your discomfort as we address possible topics that may be uncomfortable. And finally, feel free to use the chat for active engagement in today's discussion. And I'll also encourage you to unmute or raise your hand if you'd like to contribute to the discussion at any point during our presentation and our workshop today.
So as I think back again, thank you for that, Tanya. When I think back again, that first opportunity to get into the classroom and get in front of students, one thing has remained true all along the way, and that is the importance of building relational capacity and community. And we're going to spend some time doing that. So we'd love to see who is in the space with us today. And we're going to pop you into breakout rooms to have some conversation. And what we'd like you to do is to, as it says on the screen there, to share your name, your title, your region, your experience in this work, the work that we're engaged in last week and this week. And what was your favorite course in college or in school and why? I'm going to give you just a second to think through those prompts, jot down some information if you'd like to, and then we're going to pop you into relatively small breakout groups to just introduce yourselves to each other, whip around the conversation, and then we'll pop you back into the main group and do a quick debrief. Any questions before we go into breakout rooms? Here we go. All right, it looks like we have all made it back from the Zoomosphere back into the main room. Before we move on with our technology check, I'd love to hear a voice or two in the room. If we could get a couple folks to share out with regard to your conversation, maybe introduce us to either new or current colleagues.
We had opposite ends of the spectrum. I had Brian and Anthony in the room I was in, and I'm a dinosaur compared to them. They're both at the beginning of careers and in community colleges, and I'm 70 years old and thinking about what do I do with the next phase of my life, and you know, at a 4-year in Missouri. So yeah.
Nice. All right. Thanks for sharing. Ralph, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to say I was in room 6 with Mike Steiner from Missouri, if I'm not mistaken, and Shari, who's a professor of microbiology at the college where I am an adjunct lecturer in Russian and English. Yeah, we shared that. The question I had for Mike that I wanted to ask him before it was over, I just wanted to know what the difference is between a chief academic officer and the provost, but we could take that later. I'm just curious.
I wonder that myself.
Yeah.
What's in a name, right? A rose by any other name, it does smell as sweet, right?
Okay.
Yes.
And
We have, let's see, you can have chief academic officer, provost, or assistant vice president for academic affairs.
They're all the same.
I think
There
they're
you
all
go.
the same.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to be sure. Thank you.
I've heard the major difference is about $20,000 a year, but I'd leave that to Mike to confirm.
Only 20?
All right, good.
That
good
must
fun,
be
good
public
fun.
education, yeah.
Good fun. Sherry, I saw that you unmuted as well. Did you want to jump in and add to the conversation before we move on?
No, well, Ralph was pretty accurate as far as the individuals in our group and what we.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for sharing. Appreciate that.
Wonderful. So we'll move on to our technology. We're here to support you throughout this session. And if you're struggling again with the technology or internet or really any technical challenges, please do let us know. We'll be using webcams, polls, chat panel, breakout rooms, old-fashioned pen and paper. And we'll do our best to give directions on each of these tools as we use them, but please interrupt, ask questions if anything is tricky, not clear, or not working. Just a reminder that in the LMS, you have contact information for Norman and other team members. So if you need to reach out directly, please do. That contact information is found there. And we'll move on to our session objectives. So here we're going to take a look at we're going to build, I'm sorry, I got a little distracted there. We're going to make a strong case to build institutional capacity for evidence-based teaching and student-centered instruction using digital learning. And we're going to do that by discussing data related to instructional challenges based on equity and access, as well as student engagement and feedback. We'll identify obstacles to completion of gateway courses for minoritized students, and we'll clearly understand the positive impacts of that digital learning on equitable course design. Our second session together, we'll delve deeper into evidence-based teaching and student-centered instruction. And we're going to focus on the why this matters in our work and analyze data, case studies, and share strategies so that you're well equipped to make your case and support your institutional partners.
Awesome. Thanks, Tanya. Right. So our time together today will continue to focus on case making. As Tanya said, we really want to build on that rationale of why it's so important that we are engaged in this work as it relates to the two highlighted sections on our list there. So we'll briefly refresh our memories and define case making shortly. But in this case making session, just before we move on, we're focusing on, last week we focused on teaching challenges and introductory courses, student learning challenges and gateway courses. And today, of course, we are focusing on evidence-based teaching practices and student needs, digital learning, and evidence-based teaching. So today we will focus on the last two topics, as I mentioned, the evidence-based teaching and the digital learning and evidence-based teaching. And by the end of the session, you'll be able to make the case for evidence-based teaching and student-centered instruction at your institution. We are going to equip you with the data, case studies, and practical strategies so that you can get others on board at your institution to move this work forward. As we get started, I want to encourage you to send your questions through the Zoom chat. If you have anything that comes up, please pop that into the chat and we'll be monitoring that as we go along. We'll also compile a list of any questions that we don't have a chance to answer today so that we can review those and dig into them a little bit later. Again, that idea here is that we want to build this idea around case making that explores why, right? That big word why. Equitable digital learning at scale matters to support positive outcomes for minoritized and poverty-affected students. These sessions will prepare you with the data, tools, strategies to make a strong case for your peers and to implement action.
So you remember last week in session 1, we went over need 1, evidence-based teaching and student-centered instruction, where we focused on teaching challenges and introductory courses, as well as student learning challenges in gateway courses. And we basically built a case, a strong case to build institutional capacity for evidence-based teaching, student-centered instruction using digital learning. Today, in this case-making session, next slide, please. We will also focus on need 1, and we'll be focusing on evidence-based teaching practices and student needs, as well as digital learning and evidence-based teaching. And we'll build a strong case to build institutional capacity for evidence-based teaching and student-centered instruction using digital learning. And the purpose of our work today, here today, is really to seriously consider where there are equity gaps within our educational contexts and consider ways that we can replace gaps with strategies that bolster student experiences and outcomes for those who have been traditionally marginalized.
In an effort to provide some context, right? For many Black and Latinx, Indigenous, and poverty-affected students, introductory level courses are often their first exposure to college-level academic work. Unfortunately, the curriculum and instruction used in gateway courses reflect educational practices designed for majority white, male, neurotypical students from middle and upper class background. Left unexamined, of course, this is like Tanya was just talking about, we're examining our practice for the gaps. Left unexamined, these approaches create barriers for minoritized students and reinforce inequities in higher education institutions. And as you just take a second to review the slide, the information on the slide, words that jump out, right? Equity gaps and lower graduation rates. Equitable digital learning at scale supports academic leaders, faculty, institution, and staff in making inclusive course design and culturally responsive teaching practice an actionable institutional imperative. So listed here are the big questions we will consider when making a case for evidence-based teaching practices and digital learning to create equitable learning environments for minoritized students.
Oh, sorry, Trent. I think
No problem.
you're going ahead there. Yeah, we should have the next slide, 14. Apologies there. Perfect. So as Trent was saying, here we have the big questions that we're going to consider today when we're making the case for evidence-based teaching practices and digital learning to create equitable learning environments for minoritized students. So under evidence-based teaching practices and student needs, we ask the question, what are proven evidence-based teaching practices and how do they promote active and collaborative learning? And as we consider digital learning and evidence-based teaching, we ask the question, how does high quality courseware provide data and insights foundational to improving instruction? And these are not easy questions to answer, but they're critically important. They're incredibly important. So we're going to continue to build on what you've learned in the first session throughout this session today and in going forward in future sessions as well. So let's dive into evidence-based teaching practices and student needs. And here you see, I'll just give you a moment to take a look at some of these evidence-based teaching practices. You may have engaged with some of these already and may not have had a name for them, such as transparency, where we're asking faculty to provide students with clear overview of course content, learning outcomes, and assessment criteria. Right? So you're likely doing that in your classroom already with your course syllabi, as well as assignment instructions. Active learning, where we're engaging students in doing, right? The doing of learning. Formative practice, data analytics, which we're really going to focus in on today, as well as metacognition and building that sense of belonging and inclusive learning environment for our students. So we'll pause just a moment here. I'll give you a moment to read through these different definitions, but know that in the next couple of slides, we're going to dig even deeper into these concepts and these practices. So just take a moment, maybe 30 seconds to read through this, and then we'll move to the next couple of slides. We also have a handout that's prepared that you can keep. That's also going to be provided in the LMS. So that you'll have a takeaway of these different practices. Great. So in the next two slides, we'll discuss how these practices promote active learning, student ownership, and a sense of belonging and inclusion, as well as how instructors can analyze student data to differentiate instruction and make improvements to the courses in real time. When students are at the center of their learning, feel connected, and are actively engaged, it supports positive social and academic outcomes. So here we have just three of our practices here. We have our transparency, active learning by doing, as well as formative practice. And I myself, when I think about how I learn best, I'm most definitely an active learner. I like to be engaged. I like to practice doing when I have something tangible like a project that I can connect back to the real world. That's when I learn best, right? Especially as an adult learner now, I'm very picky about the types of courses that I enroll in. It has to be something that I could take back and apply directly to my own world, right? And so for me, active learning is something that I incorporate in my own classes quite a bit, as well as transparency and formative practice. That formative practice is so critical for students to be able to practice on their own and build up their skill set without those high stakes assessments that cause a lot of stress around that. So we'll move to the next slide. There. So here we have data analytics as well as metacognition, and that sense of belonging and inclusive learning environment, and really setting that stage for our students to feel like they belong in the classroom, where they can see themselves in the classroom as well. Are we representing our students in the course materials? Are we giving students voice within the classroom as well? Do they feel connected to the material? And does it apply to their life and their world as well? Going back to that active learning, right? Thinking about how students can connect what they're learning to what they're doing in their everyday lives is so critically important for embedding that learning, right? And we can tailor our classrooms, we can tailor the lessons around what the data is telling us. So we can know how students are performing, what areas should we be focusing on more, where are they struggling? So that analytics piece can really tie in and inform our teaching so that we're best meeting the needs of each individual student. So let's just take a moment, reflect on these evidence-based teaching practices. And then in pairs, we're going to select an evidence-based teaching practice that you're currently implementing and what impact it has on your students. And then we'll also pick an evidence-based teaching practice which may be more challenging to you, that maybe you haven't tried before, or maybe you did and it wasn't necessarily as successful as you had hoped. And then we're going to share why with one another. So we'll have random pairs. We'll spend about 6 minutes and then we'll return back to the room. And I'm going to make sure that I add that file here to, I can't do that. If it's possible, can we add the worksheet with the evidence-based teaching practices? Yeah. Yes, I'll actually add the instructions right here into the chat. So you'll break off in pairs. And here are the instructions. All right, welcome back. I'd love to hear what you discussed. If you wouldn't mind unmuting or raising your hand, or also using that chat box. What did you learn from each other? Okay, I'll wait.
I'm seeing 14 of us here, so
Thanks.
probably need to wait a few seconds.
Got a little ahead of myself.
Take two.
Take two. That's great. That's great that folks are still having dialogue. That's wonderful. I don't want to shortchange that. All right. Confirming that everyone is back. Maybe give it another 10 seconds. All right, while we wait, I'd love to hear what you learned from each other. Feel free to raise your hand, unmute, or use the chat box. Any questions?
I'll go.
Yeah, Michael.
So I was in with Unok, and we were talking about our different strategies, and she's using, well, what she does very well, as she described it, and I can tell she does it very well, is focusing on transparency and clear expectations in her syllabus. But also what she was describing, which I thought she did very well, is building sort of scaffolding assignments into her larger year-end assignments so that students can do smaller assignments, get feedback on those assignments, and then incorporate that feedback into the larger project down the road. So I thought that was really an excellent technique for differentiating learning and supporting student outcomes.
Great use of formative practice, using those smaller assignments, low stakes assignments to give students an opportunity to practice, build up their skill level so that when it comes time for the summative assessment, you know, those high stakes assessments, they're prepared, they feel more confident in their skill set. That's a wonderful example. Anyone else?
Me, okay.
Hi, Ralph.
Hi, I was in with Shari.
Yes.
Shari said she's not presently doing any teaching. She hasn't for a bit because she's working on a master's degree. And so one thing that she talked about that I also do is the same thing that Michael was referencing, this idea of scaffolding. I came across that years ago. Our college has a writing across the curriculum program. And that was one thing that was strongly introduced, this idea of low stakes assignments, several of them so that they have a chance to build up their confidence, et cetera, et cetera. So I use that. And Shari also mentioned that when she was teaching, that was a large part of her practice. And then for the thing I really was interested in is finding out how to access the data that we need to make some of these assessments, and then what are the assessments we're making based on the data? What are the questions we're asking? And then also, as Michael mentioned, also the idea of transparency. One of the things, again, I learned from writing across the curriculum of every course I teach, I always write at least a one-page welcome letter. No matter what the title of the course is, students never know specifically what aspects of it you may be stressing or talking about. So I always write a welcome letter, fully explaining, putting it in the context of what's going on in the world today. Like I'm doing a course on Thomas Paine, which is very appropriate to what's happening in America today.
Yeah.
And then I asked them to give me a one-page response, which they always thank me for the letter. Thank you, I now understand. It's the beginning of being able to establish a personal relationship with them. And yeah, that's pretty much what we cover.
Yeah, building that sense of belonging, that inclusiveness, you know, making that student feel welcome, right? And then the writing across the curriculum, contextualizing writing, making it relevant to their lives, right? So that writing is not just a course, it's something that they do as an everyday process, right? So that's wonderful. And you're building up, from what I've heard, everybody's the metacognitive skills, right? We're teaching students how to learn, right? We're helping them learn how to be learners by giving them this guidance around the learning environment. So wonderful examples. Before we move on, I did want to acknowledge there was a question that came in the chat a little bit earlier around what systemic barriers are. And first, before I give you my definition of that, does anyone in the room want to provide their definition of what a systemic barrier is that your students may be encountering? Anybody? No? Okay, so systemic barriers for particularly minoritized students can occur in any number of ways by way of the institution at large in higher education, right? So when we're talking about systemic barriers, we're not necessarily referencing one specific institution, but the institution of education generally, specifically, higher education. When we think about competitive entry programs, just as an example, there is potential there for systemic barriers for minoritized students, financial aid, Pell Grants, but even our own advising centers on campus could be potential areas for systemic barriers where we're not acknowledging the needs of minoritized students. We're not acknowledging potential barriers in their learning that they may be encountering, right? So how we schedule our courses, right, may not allow all students to be able to enroll, just as an example. So systemic barriers occur basically throughout the institution of education, where students are not necessarily seeing themselves in their own classes that they're enrolling in. They're engaging in assessments that are not necessarily relevant. And we're not establishing success. We're not establishing an environment where students can be successful, where all students can be successful. So when we're talking about systemic barriers, really it's a prevalence throughout the entirety of education, and we're acknowledging those barriers. And by way of these conversations and these workshops, we're finding ways where we can break down these barriers, right? And we're talking about here evidence-based teaching practices, where we are modifying the way we teach so that we're providing a supportive learning environment so that our students can be successful, right? And so we're using adaptive courseware, we're using digital learning tools so that we are providing an environment that gives students the tools to be successful. And that's a really big kind of 30,000 foot, vantage point, but there's many ways that we could encounter these barriers, and there's still so much work that we need to do. But being here today and having these conversations is a step forward in eliminating these barriers. So I appreciated that question.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
Yeah,
Tanya, for picking up the question. Because I'm
Yes.
reading some articles, and then one day I think I know, I have some good understanding. Next day,
Yeah.
somehow I got confused. So I wanted to
Yeah.
kind of see, your perspectives. So thank you
Absolutely.
for picking up the question. And yeah, feel free to add some more thread. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, Tanya, I think you did a phenomenal job of overlaying that from that perspective. And I think as you talked about the fact that we're in these spaces, having these conversations, examining practice, because a lot of those systems that were put in place maybe decades ago and haven't been reviewed, haven't been examined, haven't been questioned, may have been put in place with the best of intentions. And yet now, as we start peeling back the layer of the onion, we recognize, wait a second, like in North Carolina, placement testing, for example, right?
Yeah.
Oh, this is great. It would really give us an indication of who is ready for college level classes and not. And yet we found out in a partnership with the Center for Community College Research Center that placement testing was not a very good indicator of student success and predicting student success in college, but it was a system-wide, statewide system that had been in place for years until a number of folks decided to take a closer look at it. But I appreciate that question as well, Yoon, because again, it really does challenge us to look at the systems that we have in place at an institutional level and sometimes at a broader level as well.
Yeah, great. So we're going to continue to revisit these practices throughout these sessions, not just in this session, but we'll be picking up and expanding upon and going deeper into a number of these practices throughout these sessions. So I definitely look forward to having and continuing this conversation as we and anchoring it within, recognizing that there are systemic barriers. I think that's so critically important, and so thankful for that question. So we're going to develop these strategies, and we'll support the application of evidence-based teaching practices within your institutions and how you could apply these to your classrooms as well. Trent?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So when we think about evidence-based practices, we also not just look at best practice from a faculty perspective, but also, of course, from that learner experience. So I'm just going to take a second here, and as we look at each one of these quotes from students, when we think about transparency helps students plan for upcoming assignments. I often think about transparency, whether it's the course syllabus or whether it's your learning outcomes your performance outcomes for a specific lesson. It's so important that students are able to see where they are going, what the expectations are. And Michael, you called out that Yoon talks about being very clear in the syllabus, so students understand those expectations from day one. Students will know how to respond if we are clear. As Brene Brown would say, clear is kind, unclear is unkind, right? So that transparency helps students plan for upcoming events. When we think about student self-regulation, it helps students set their own goals and demonstrate their abilities. And of course, these are, it's so important that we consider the students and their voices. And then creating, as Tanya mentioned earlier, this sense of belonging for our students, creating an environment of positive inclusivity so that students not only feel like they have a sense of connectedness in their classroom and on their campus, but they see themselves in that classroom as well. So when we surveyed students say that evidence-based teaching practices help them feel more included, know what is expected of them, and assess their own progress. And again, Michael, I appreciate what you said earlier about the scaffolding, right? The scaffolding, breaking those larger assignments into smaller chunks so that students have some guidance as they're building towards a larger assignment and a larger assessment at the end of the semester. When we think about that student perspective, students feeling more included, understanding and knowing what's expected of them, and then able to assess their own progress. Why does this matter? Give us just a couple of about 30 seconds to just think, why does this matter? And as you think about that, I'd love to hear a couple of voices in the room. Why does this matter? Why does the student voice matter in terms of inclusivity, knowing what is expected of them, that transparency, and that formative assessment, formative strategies, so they are able to assess their own progress? Feel free to unmute and jump in with us.
One thing I noticed the past couple of semesters since March 20th, many students have mentioned to me in my classes that they find it extraordinarily difficult to regulate their work when because they've never been online before. So even when you give them deadlines, they're finding, you'll have deadlines for your course online. I have deadlines for this course online. I have deadlines for that course online. And I'm working this into my life in a way I've never had to work it in before, when I had a class on Monday and Wednesday at 9. So
Thanks.
I was curious how to mitigate that, because I'd say a good portion of my students questioned me about that, or gave me that as an example of a problem they were really having trouble with.
Mhm. Yeah. Neil, I see that you dropped that in the chat. It provides each student an equal chance for success. Would you mind unmuting and just talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, when we could be transparent and more clear with our expectations, then each student will sort of know what is expected of them, and that way it's not as mysterious as to what we're looking for as their instructor for an assignment or project or whatever.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and Ralph, to your point as well, I think this idea of us, this ongoing communication with our students, right? It's one thing to put a whole bunch of information in a syllabus at the front of a semester, but that formative piece falls away when we're not engaging the students in those expectations all throughout. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I'm really intrigued by the parallels between healthcare and education, in which case the patient and the student are the owners of the process. And that ownership is essential. They just simply do not learn, or they just simply do not get well unless they take ownership of that process themselves. So being a part of that communication is essential to ownership.
Yeah, and I like that. And Tanya, that goes back to what you mentioned earlier about when we have that interaction and that engagement, right? We can't expect students to take ownership if they're not engaged, and that being engaged means that we're using these evidence-based teaching practices to make them part of the learning from our perspective. Go ahead, Yoon. We'll go one more here.
Yeah, actually, Mike just said what I wanted to say. So you read on my mind. So I just want to say that, we don't want our students to be a passive recipient of information. We want them to be really actively engaged in the process, so we can provide some meaningful learning opportunities for them. So that is the reason why it is important to apply or implement these practices in our teaching.
Absolutely, Yoon. Thank you for calling that out. I just sort of reiterated that in the chat, right? We can't expect students to be interactive and active and proactive unless we're creating that space and opportunity by engaging them in the evidence-based student-centered practices. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And just I think the healthcare example is such a great one, because, we've all had, or I know I have anyway, poor doctors that didn't communicate effectively, right? We've all had that doctor with poor bedside manner, and, they hold all the cards and they keep your own medical information, kind of secret, and they're not very transparent or open about that information, right? And that doesn't make us a very good patient, right? We can't be our own advocates if we don't have that critical information about our own health. So imagine then how that translates into the classroom when we don't have that information that we need to be advocates for our own education, right? So that transparency is so critical and important. So great point, Mike. I think that was like spot on. Wonderful. So we can move on. And so these highlighted practices on the left side here, thinking back just to this conversation that we just had, these create inequities and further broaden that learning gap that we've been talking about, those systemic barriers, right? And these are actually some really good examples of how we see those systemic barriers in our own classrooms. So these lead to unequal completion rates in introductory courses among students, all students, but specifically students of lower economic status and racially minoritized students. So, just taking a look at some of these practices here, voluntary academic support. Now, this one's an interesting one because we're thinking to ourselves, well, we're providing academic support, right? And students can go and they can engage and they could do this on their own, and we don't need to provide a lot of support here, right? But we're actually making things really difficult, particularly for students of color and students low economic status students, to get over that stereotype threat, that hurdle. that fear of asking for help, and it just reinforces negative academic performance. So instead, a recommendation is actually to embed academic supports where it's actually required into the classroom itself, right? So all students have access to these different supports. It's embedded right there in the classroom, and students don't have to face that stigma, of asking for help. Academic support outside of class, again, we want to make sure that we're acknowledging that we'll have a breadth of students who have different needs and different backgrounds. And so, those students who work full time, getting to that academic support outside of class time makes it really difficult for them if they're full time. And so again, we want to make sure that we're providing support to students where they need it most, not where we've decided it should be, and that's a really important mind shift, right? And so we need to think through those things. And I see, David, you have your hand up. I want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, Mike's gonna make note of this, I'm sure. I wanted to comment that I've seen both ends of this spectrum, but from an institutional perspective, because institutionally, we can make it open and welcoming, but if the institution itself doesn't, and here's my point. First college I taught at full-time was an HBCU, and they didn't have a lot of space on campus. So they used a historic building that was on campus, but it was this old, small house. And that was where they had tutoring. It was in the middle of campus, and everybody could see you walking across campus as you went to this little house. And so they always had a challenge getting people to go to the house. When I came to Northwest Missouri State, my second year here, they instituted a tutoring place, but it was on the second floor of the library. And everybody goes to the library because the first floor is where Starbucks is. So what do everybody's going to the library because Starbucks is in the library. And at the same time, there's enough people going to that all the time that the last statistic I heard was that every member of the football team makes it in there at least once every year. It isn't a stigma to go. And the other school I was at, the institution actually made it awful to go there.
Great example. Thank you, David. Great example. You queued up Mike. I'm just checking if he has a comment. No. Okay, great. And just finally, thinking about curve grades, and I think I've seen this less and less with the curving of the grades, but it's still there. I think it's kind of like been embedded in academia. But curving the grades automatically creates competition for higher grades, and racially minoritized students and Pell eligible students specifically tend to, statistically are more likely to be in the bottom 1/3 of the curve, right? So it doesn't benefit them in any kind of way. So, shifting then towards those equitable instructional practices, the embedding academic supports, the active learning, early and frequent feedback, and again, tying in the data analytics piece, right? Because the data analytics is really going to provide us the actual data, not not our hunches, not our thinking around, how our students are learning. It really is going to be objective information around student performance, and then how can we bridge those gaps that we're seeing in our own classrooms, right? So let's just reflect on these questions that we're going to put in the chat here, and which equitable practice will you continue to incorporate, or what will you begin doing, and what will you stop doing? Let's take a look. Oh, I'm just going to read Heather's comment here. There's research on writing centers that shows that when you require students to go, they get a lot less out of it. They tend to have a more negative attitude because they're there just because my professor made me. Right. Not always a best practice to require. And I think just picking up on that, I think it's important to just have a little bit of a footnote on that. I think it's important that we require academic support and embed it in our classrooms with a purpose, right? Not just for the sake of sending a student there, you know, because students are not going to know, but going back to that transparency piece, and this is where that feedback is so critical, right? So it's not so much requiring students to use the support, but having that conversation with the student around, you know, where are the areas that they really need to focus in on, tying that back to the supports that they can receive, and then having that open dialogue and conversation with the student so that they're anchored in understanding why these supports are necessary, right? So I think it's very important that when we're using these supports, such a great point, Heather, honestly, I'm really happy that you brought that up, that we're providing context, right? That we're having that adult conversation with our students. You know, these are the supports that you need to help you be a better student, to bridge those gaps in performance, and ultimately to be successful in the classroom. Mike says, our supplemental instruction program is challenging because it is highly beneficial, but also falls under number 2. It's not available to many of our students that are working. Yeah. So what are some ways, Mike, I'd like to have a conversation about that your institution could think about how they can open that up so that it's more available to students?
Well, to Dave's point, we've tried to duplicate that in the courses where we have supplemental instruction available with additional tutoring in our Student Success Center, which is a common space, as Dave pointed out. So we have 5 or 6 different functions in that space, including general library use. So students who aren't available to avail themselves of that have individual opportunity. I think the problem is one of the benefits to supplemental instruction is it's very colleague-based. Students working with each other are an essential part of that. It's really an organized study group as opposed to a tutoring session. So, you know, we have different methods for encouraging students to form additional study groups, but it's very difficult. And, you know, we've tried with our scheduling. One of the ways that the way that we schedule our supplemental instruction is basically a class poll. So the supplemental instructor will go through a process at the beginning of the course to try to identify the optimal time for the most number of students and then schedule them accordingly. But that's why I say it's challenging. We don't have a good fix for it.
Yeah. I don't have a good fix for you either right at the moment, but let me chew on that a little bit and I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
Let me do some research.
Even buckets of money don't solve it easily.
Right.
You still run into the same thing. But if you do have buckets of money, we'll take them.
I definitely don't have buckets of money.
Well, and Mike, I think back not that long ago as a practitioner where we worked to leverage the digital space to create opportunities for students outside of that when they did have to go to work, where they were creating those collaborative study groups outside of the classroom, but reconvening in a digital space rather than, so at the time, our supplemental instructors were using things like Google Hangouts and Google Meets, where they would facilitate a convening and then kind of turn the students loose on it. So there is no right one answer or one bucket of money, as you were saying, to answer that question, but certainly looking at different ways to leverage different tools, digital tools specifically, or the virtual environment, especially now as we know so much more about what we're able to do in the virtual space than we might have thought possible even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, we experimented with some recording options where the sessions could be recorded, and then a student who was unable to attend could go back and at least listen in on their classmates having these discussions. And the problem is that turned, by our observation, to some degree of negative reinforcement for actually coming in person. So the attendance went way down and we had more people waiting to see a recording. And that also had, was kind of an identity problem for the students who come to the group. If it was only 5 or 6 of them, to be on a recording was uncomfortable for them.
that's can tend to be somewhat passive in terms of
Yeah.
student engagement rather than what we're driving at with the active participation as well.
We put that in a category called solution, but not good solution.
Yeah, peer learning communities. There's some emerging research around this. I'm gonna dig into the research there for you, Mike. That might help answer some of those questions. And Theo, I saw your question around examples of how we could use data, and I'm just going to ask that you hold that question because we're going to actually give you some examples and some slides later on in the presentation. Great conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, Trent, you're next.
Yeah, so let's take a minute as we go to the next slide. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So when we think about evidence-based teaching practices and introductory courses, let's take a minute to just silently reflect on the data on this slide. And as you reflect, thinking about what resonates with you. Is there anything there that surprises you? I'm going to pause here and give us about a minute to do that. And again, we've been having such great conversation today. I'd like to invite some new voices into the room. If there's someone who hasn't shared or would like to jump in and be part of this conversation, this great conversation, as we look at this data, what resonates with you? Is there anything surprising in the data?
Excuse me?
The
Go ahead, Sharon.
transparency. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Heather. Go ahead. You jump in. That's great.
In the like the 80% transparency, is this from like the professors are saying I'm being really transparent, or what? I mean, what is this date? I'm just confused by what these percentages mean.
Yeah, well, so there's some differences there, right? Well, most faculty likely provide transparent course overview and engage students in learning by doing. There are differences across the perspective, right? So for math and computer science, for example, they are above the average in active learning. But humanities and social science faculty are often advanced in the use of inclusive teaching. When we look at those numbers, we're talking about the evidence-based teaching practices being used in introductory courses.
Okay, because I just see transparency and I think, okay, I think a lot of people are trying really hard to be transparent, but from the student perspective, they might feel like, yeah, I did a lot of active learning, but wasn't very transparent. Like, you know, like if the students were answering how much of this stuff is going on, I think we might get different percentages.
I don't disagree, right? And yeah, so this really is, as Van has dropped into the chat, right? We're thinking about from the faculty perspective, right? And so yeah, what they think in terms of being transparent versus that student voice as well, which is always a critical piece of taking into consideration the student voice. But is there anything else that jumps out at you in terms of where that data sits? Sherry, I saw that you had unmuted earlier.
I was thinking about something. Sorry.
No problem.
I think it's also important to recognize that faculty aren't using all 6 categories of evidence-based teaching practices here in this chart. But that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, in your own classroom that you wouldn't be incorporating all of these to some degree, right? Depending on the discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tanya. I mean, and that's kind of what I was trying to call out earlier with the when we think about math and computer science faculty with regard to active teaching versus humanities and social science and inclusive teaching. But you're exactly right, right? We recognize that most faculty are not using all six categories at all the time, right? But as we look at this, let's reflect on this. How are you using these practices across disciplines? What assumptions are being made? And Heather, you sort of already alluded to this, right? What assumptions are being made about how you teach, whether it's math or humanities or computer science? Transparency is the shorthand of the bar is titled, I'm sorry, Kristen. Transparency is.
Yeah, so I was just, sorry, responding to the question posed.
Go ahead.
Comment up above the what I heard in your question was transparency is a really broad word, and what instructors were responding to was the response that I chatted in as well, that they're
Right.
providing students with a clear overview.
Right.
The bar is the shorthand.
Right. Thank you. So again, how are you using these practices across your disciplines? Feel free to drop those responses into the chat or go ahead and unmute. We're enjoying this conversation.
I teach a lot of writing classes, and metacognition is like one of the main things that we do throughout, like all the time. So they're always reflecting on their learning process, they're reflecting on their writing process, thinking about how what they're learning now will help them in the future, and all of those kinds of things. So I think metacognition is probably one of the highest ones for me personally, but in a lot of writing classes, we do a lot of metacognitive and self-reflection kinds of things.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Heather, and critical, right? We can't expect students to understand how and why they're learning or engaging in the process if we don't give them an opportunity to reflect and think about their own thinking, think about their own learning and how they're processing that, right? Anyone else? Deborah says, I use quite a bit of formative practice because it is lower stakes for the students in introductory courses. Great, thank you for sharing, Deborah. Great point, right? I think of formative assessment sort of like being guardrails, when helps us keep students on the path and helps them understand where they are on that path in terms of teaching and learning as a process. So thank you for adding that to the chat. Great. All right, and Tanya mentioned in response to Theo's question earlier that we we're going to take a look at some data points, or some data analytics as well.
Yep. First, we'll take a look at this data here. And so adaptive courseware users are significantly more likely to use data analytics to improve instruction, as you can see here in this slide. So while just over a third of adaptive courseware users say they're acting on real-time data, many still report using whole class performance dashboards. So we're looking at aggregated data, not necessarily disaggregated data. And dashboards for individual students as well. So it's really important when we're looking at the data that we're getting both. We're getting an understanding of whole class performance, but we also want to be, really understanding that the data can give us information about single individual students as well. And you'll see here, there's comparisons between non-courseware users, non-adaptive, right? There's a difference between adaptive and then non-adaptive courseware as well. So just take a look at this slide just for a moment, and then we'll answer some questions around which of these practices are you using in your highest enrollment course this term, and what data, if any, are you currently using in your course to inform your instruction. I recognize that you may not be using data yet, and that's okay to say that. So I'm going to go ahead and pop those questions right in the chat. Oh, they're already there. Thank you, Patty. So how many of you have been using data to inform your teaching practices? Or maybe you haven't at all, and that's okay to say that out loud too. Maybe we could do this. If you raise your hand, if you do use data. All right, we have some folks who are using data, but not everyone. Right. Well, that's exactly why we're here. We're going to talk a little bit more about how we can use data in our classrooms. So next slide. All right, Trent.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to take a look at a case from the University of North Texas, right? At the University of North Texas, educators showed that using formative practice, and I love this because we've had, Tanya, we've had a number of conversations around formative assessment, formative practice, right? That using those bite-sized chunks, and Michael, you mentioned that earlier, right? Taking those bite-sized chunks and scaffolding them, lower stakes, less pressure on the students. but that in a remote setting can be significantly, can be used significantly to improve comprehension and student outcomes. So let's take a look. Let's consider on the next slide, let's consider our teacher, Jason, a senior lecturer in chemistry. He's teaching fully online and is challenged with knowing whether students are following along. His solution is to share bite-sized course material in low-stakes testing and small group review enabled by courseware. The result is improved student performance, right? So as we think about this as an example of frequent bite-sized assignment, low-stakes quizzing, Jason provides opportunities for his students to earn half points for answering the quiz questions correctly, but they must work in their groups to earn the other half point for the week's small group work, right? What do you think of this example of formative practice in action? What other formative practices can help you assess student progress? And thank you, Norma. This case is in your LMS. What do you think? And again, we've already had. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, so this resonates with me a bit because I do this as well. I didn't even know I was doing formative practices and using data. So this is a little bit of a discovery here. I've been using with my LMS just these short little quizzes that that students are supposed to do before. I don't even call them quizzes, I call them homework assignments. And then that counts towards their grade. I don't do the second half, which might be a nice way to supplement it with small group work. But also some of the feedback that I've gotten has been mixed because some of the students have felt pressured by having to do these low stake assignments. They don't actually perceive it as low stake. And so now I'm starting to reassess this component. Maybe I just am doing too many of them. But that's why this resonated with me, and I just wanted to share that experience.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Michael. And I'll circle back to when we talked earlier about the student voices, right? Communicating with them as to why they're engaged in the work and really helping them understand what low stakes assignments are and chunking that material into bite-sized pieces doesn't mean that they're not supposed to do it, but it also means that, again, that you can then use that formative practice to provide them the kind of feedback that they need to improve on progress. And as Tanya mentioned earlier, that's part of that transparency piece as well, right? They have to know how well they're doing or not doing in order to improve. Go ahead, David.
What Michael said really caught my attention because a few years ago, I've got one assignment that I use on interpersonal communication in an intro speech course to help the students understand what the concepts on perspective mean, what cultural communication means when you dig down into it, or what relationship communication, how that's different. And I use episodes of TV shows like Big Bang and Blue Bloods and This Is Us, which they can relate to and they can find it free. But then in the process, what Michael mentioned was something that I did early on, which is break it into small pieces. They're going to build a 4 to 5 page paper, which is frightening to a incoming freshman. They're going to build a 4 to 5 page paper, but they're going to do it one small piece at a time, just like you eat an elephant, one small piece at a time. And they just do the perspective piece. And they have to look at the episode, then they have to look at the concept in the textbook, they have to connect the two. And about 90% of the time, they forget about the textbook. And then we get to class. And originally, I was reviewing those, giving them feedback, and giving them a very, very small grade, less than 10 points. And half of them weren't doing it because 10 points, when students always see 100-point assignments, who cares? And the amount of that, when I've got a couple hundred students that I'm trying to do this for, becomes overwhelming when you have that every other day with these students. So what I changed it to is they have to bring it to class, and then they're in groups of 2 or 3, and they react to each other, and they edit each other's work, and then they share out a little bit, not all of it, but a little bit with the class. And then we do it all over again. So we build the first part, then we build the second part, and we have this discussion, 3 separate classes building up to the paper at the end, and they've written most of the paper with peer review of that paper and no grades attached to it. And in one class in particular, right now that I'm working with is a very small class. I'm able to get around to each group and react to them. Doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
The larger classes doesn't happen. And with
Yeah,
a large lecture class, you can't do that.
Yeah, David, I appreciate you calling that out, hearing that entire process and maybe the bumps along the way, and then, you know, developing those solutions along the way. That's absolutely critical, right? As we examine our own practice. So thank you for calling that out. I also really appreciate, you know, you mentioned this idea of building students' confidence, right? Where when they're looking at a large assignment, some students are going to say, well, I can't even, there's no way I can do this. But as we mentioned earlier, exactly as we mentioned earlier, someone called out the idea of academic confidence, right? That if we provide students with that those small bite-sized chunks and provide them the kind of feedback they need to go to build and scaffold, we know that the students, I mean, again, this is grounded in this evidence-based teaching practices, that the students are going to be much more likely. It doesn't mean that there's a magic wand, but we know that the students are going to be much more likely to be engaged and be successful and obviously improve their student learning outcomes. When we think about the key takeaways of what we've engaged in so far, right? This idea of evidence-based teaching practices promote active learning. You called this out earlier, right? Students aren't going to be active on their own accord. We have to create that environment and use the learning strategies that promote active learning. Student engagement, student ownership in their learning, a sense of belonging and a sense of inclusion, that evidence-based teaching practices have a positive impact on the learner experience. We heard from those learner voices already. That adaptive courseware, users are significantly more likely to use data analytics to improve their instruction, and that those formative practices that we've just spent a bit of time talking about and digging into, right? Those bite-sized assignments and low-stakes testing or quizzes or homework assignments in a remote setting can significantly improve comprehension and student outcomes. So as we think about this chunk of information that we've dug into together, how do these key takeaways impact your role at your institution? Just a couple of things to think about, reflective questions. And how could you implement these practices, and what might it look like? And just get you to jot those thoughts and ideas into your notes and great into the chat. Sheila, as a final assignment to prepare for a 10-page research, they have 3 earlier assignments: learning to search the internet, creating a search, creating an outline, a bibliography, so again, chunking those large assignments so that, and providing them feedback all along the way. I'm assuming, I mean, probably shouldn't assume, but I'm guessing. Apply these skills as they're reading a short article. Great, thank you. Yes, thank you. All right.
Okay, let's do a quick check. I'm sorry, I'm hearing some background noise there. Just really quick, thumbs up. How's everybody feeling? Are we feeling okay? We're feeling good? Okay, just do a quick check. How's the data resonating with you? How is this information resonating? It's all good? Okay, great. So yeah, let's keep moving on then. Let's take a look at digital learning and evidence-based teaching then. Let's move right along. Here we go.
Awesome. So Tan, you mentioned digital learning and evidence, and we've already started to dip our toe into this sort of idea of how we can use these digital resources to really support evidence-based teaching and learning. So when we think about this, right, when we think about the adaptive courseware, it allows students to move through the course materials with flexibility on their own demonstrated or based on their own demonstrated knowledge and skills. And we've had some conversation along that line already, right? That students are able to engage at different times on their own pace. That provides some challenges as well, but we've been working through there. It changes the content and or the degree of difficulty to keep students engaged. So again, that idea, Yoon, I think you called out scaffolding earlier, how important that is. Students are achieving and at a rate that meets their needs at that particular time, and they're able to build on that. And it provides immediate feedback so students can self-assess and monitor their own progress. Think about a student engaging in that adaptive courseware where they're able to do something and get that immediate feedback. And David, as you mentioned earlier, doing that with a class of 100 or 200 students can be really difficult. But when we're engaging the use of adaptive courseware, then we're allowing for that adaptive courseware to give us a hand with some of that feedback. So as we consider the benefits of adaptive courseware for students, right, we're thinking through a number of different things, but students find working in an online platform sometimes maybe not as boring as just doing work from an assigned textbook. Also makes grading assignments feel more fair to students because they know that they're getting that immediate feedback from the software, not waiting for an instructor or a teacher's assistant giving them a grade. And so there's this idea of it's objective and fair. And as we think about this adaptive course, we're actually going to dive into a short video, a video clip from Jeannie Grusendorf, a political science professor at Georgia State University. And as we watch the clip, let's jot down some ideas where you can use data to adapt courseware to student needs and promote engagement and retention. We're going to take a look at the video. And again,
for me, the second really big part about utilizing the courseware is that I can look at the analytics, and maybe you don't need adaptive courseware for this. Analytics are out there in other areas, but it's really nice to see how many students of my class have done before coming to class, and then maybe using a variety of ways of just quickly testing that they remember some of those basic concepts, and then I can and then I can teach what is much more interesting. So rather than repeating the basics of something because they didn't do their reading, they've done the basics, and we can now go down into the weeds and really explore some global issues. So that to me is really key.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're going to actually give you an opportunity. Yes, Tanya, I love that she keeps going and doesn't know. All right, so we're actually going to pop you into some short breakout rooms here just to have a quick conversation with regard to your notes and your thoughts. And again, as we think about it, how does Professor Grusendorf utilize data to adapt her courseware, and how do you use data analytics to design and adapt your courseware? We're going to pop you into your breakout rooms for just a few minutes to have about 4 minutes, have a conversation, and when we come back, we'll do a quick share out and move forward from there. All right. Welcome back. Welcome back. We're getting there. I see we've got 17 folks back in the room with us, so we're getting there. Here we go. Welcome back. I'm glad that the Zoomosphere has let you all back in with us into the main room. So let's just have a quick couple of report outs, a couple of share outs from your conversation. Just go ahead and unmute. We'll jump you in and let you add to the conversation here. When we think about the video, how does Professor Grusendorf utilize data to adapt the courseware, and how are you using data analytics to design and adopt your courseware? If you don't have a specific answer, David, go ahead.
I'm going to throw Sherry under the bus. I'd like her to share what happens in her microbiology classes, because I think that's a critical element when you've got an intro course and you've got a large class. So I'm going to stop and just let her talk.
Awesome. Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, David. Go ahead, Sherry.
Yeah, so I was explaining that I do use some adaptive courseware for my instruction, for in-class activities as well as homework assignments. But it does help in microbiology where students can't see really what's going on inside of the body or inside of the cell. So having sometimes a video or something where they can replay over again with questions, that does help in biology coursework and maybe in some classrooms, but I don't know if it will always work in the courseware works for every class, unless you find something that will fit for what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. I mean, because that goes back to when we talk about the benefits of adaptive courseware. It allows students to move through the course material with flexibility on their own as they demonstrate their knowledge. So, hey, maybe I didn't hear that right. Maybe I didn't get it in my notes properly, but I can click and go back and play it again.
I can look at the analytics, and maybe you don't.
As Norma just shared with us, we can click it and play it again. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. I don't want to cut anybody short if there's anybody else that would like to jump in. Otherwise, we'll move along.
Needed.
Great. We're going to take a look at a case study now, and we're going to pop that case study in the chat. And we'll just take a minute or two. It's very brief, just a minute or two to take, read through that individually. Oh, the study is in the LMS. So if you can navigate over to the LMS, you'll find the case study there. And it's the A&M Commerce case study. Just take a minute or two. We'll say we're 34 right now, so at 36. And as you're reading, I'm going to ask you to think about a couple of questions, and I'm going to pop those questions in the chat right now. Just think through. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Patty. Patty's ahead of me. So the case study references my lab. Professor Un uses my lab in her classroom. So how does it personalize the learning experience? How does it contribute to formative practice? And in what ways does Professor Un use data to contribute to student success? So think about those questions as you're reading through that brief case study. We'll talk about this as a group. I just want to make sure everybody was able to access the case study. Can you find it okay? Do you need help locating it? I see Gail needs some help locating it. Can we, maybe we could share the LMS? Maybe that's a good idea. That might help the participants to locate it. Yeah, it'll be titled case study, and it'll be TAMU Commerce Math. I'm not sure, I can't recall what it's named in the LMS, but that is the case study file. There we go. There we go. Here we go. Perfect. Thank you for that link. Yep. So we'll log into D2L. Maybe we could back up one more time. Oh. There we go. Let's navigate back to D2L just for a moment. Yeah, there we go. And let's say if we're on the landing page, I think it'll be course home where we typically will land. Yeah. So here's the home page. Yeah, an announcement will automatically pop up. Then we scroll down and there's case making. And then when we're in case making, you'll navigate on the left, pre-session information. And then we'll scroll down, preparing for session 2, which is today. There we go. Gail got it. Excellent. And then as we navigate down, you'll find the resources. And that'll be true for every session going forward. You'll always find pre-work and pre-readings in D2L in preparation for the session. So you could always work ahead if you'd like to. Great. All right, so as you read through that case study then, and thinking through those questions that we provided in the chat, how was MyLab used in the classroom, and how did the data support student success? Anybody want to jump in? So what was interesting, I'll say my perspective when I read through that was that it was, the challenges were very obvious, right? So there was a conversation about maybe the student was a little bit overwhelmed, going back to what Michael was saying in terms of formative practice and using those low stakes assessments. And he found that his students weren't necessarily aware that they're low stakes. They treat all assessments as high stakes. And maybe there's too many of them. Well, Professor Un had a very similar experience. Maybe students were being a little bit overwhelmed, right? But that homework, that formative practice that the My IT lab was using was very helpful for students, right? And so she was able to use the data to determine, you know, maybe students are being overassessed, and then also identify where those weak points that students were having difficulty in. And so that really helped to inform the teaching practices. Anybody else have some insights there that you'd like to share?
Yeah, the guy from Missouri that talks too much. In our intro course for communication, the previous textbook, it came with a bank of quizzes for the chapters.
Yes.
And there was an analytic part to the software that would tell us how many students had answered which question correct.
Yeah.
And so we could take a look at that and do a quick analysis and say, okay, on chapter 3 on perspective, they don't get this concept and this concept because half the class missed that question.
Yeah.
So that kind of analytics was wonderful.
Yeah.
We're 2 generations beyond that. We don't have that anymore.
But that's spot on, David. I think it really helps to, one, identify if, there's a concept that the entire class needs additional help on. Do we need to, provide some remediation there? And then we can also identify individual students, right? It's like, okay, when we use data analytics, we can find trends, across student performance individually, as well as for the whole class. And then it also helps to inform us, well, maybe we're just doing too many assessments, or there's just too much content here, right? So we're constantly, as educators, like even in this session here, we're constantly iterating and thinking through, okay, this is where the conversation is going. This is where we need to spend more time. These are the concepts that probably need a little bit more attention. Yep, we can adapt, modify our teaching style along the way, right? So we're really truly being responsive to our students. We're being responsive to our students' learning needs. We're not sticking necessarily to how we've set up the class, and we're not, being absolutely we're not forcing the outline onto our students. We're responding to that. We're adapting to the learning needs of our students. So ultimately, that was my takeaway from this specific case study, was that yes, there was definitely some challenges. It was really obvious that students had to kind of navigate how to use the system. How are they learning how to do the assessments? But then once students were in the system, what is that telling us now? What are students needing in terms of learning, right? So that was my big takeaway there. Yeah, Mandy says, in the case study, I appreciated the professor is still working on a better solution. Absolutely. We're constantly iterating, right? We're constantly iterating on our courses. She tried something, saw how it worked, considered ways to improve on it. Exactly. Yep. You don't have to have the class perfect all the time. Just like when that video, like she just, she made a little mistake and she kept going. And I remember when I first started using video in my own courses, like I constantly edited. But if we're in the classroom, hey, stream of consciousness, we make mistakes, we mispronounce things all the time. I do it all the time. So we are human too, and we're showing that to our students. But the takeaway from this is that, we're constantly iterating, we're trying new things, and the tools themselves are not going to be perfect. Full disclosure, full transparency, they never are. But we work through them and we find out ways to make them work for our students and help our students. So I think that was definitely the main takeaway there. And the digital tools, are giving us that insight into other pieces of information about our students that we wouldn't necessarily have access to, right? So I think that that gives us a lot of key intel. Great ideas here. Okay. So then, thinking about the benefits of courseware, not just in this case study, but generally, we need to think about the benefits of using adaptive courseware and other digital learning tools. So there's the potential to improve student success rates in foundational courses. It provides richer student data that is possible with textbooks, for instance. There's a movement in the OER space too around this, so that there's a potential there too. There's the potential to reduce the cost of course materials, even when we're working with publishers. We've found that when we incorporate these coursewares into our courses, it actually winds up costing less for students, not more, which is, a misnomer around this space. And also, it can help institutions meet their larger goals, right? It improves affordability, it improves access, retention, equity, right? So there's a lot of benefits to using courseware in our courses. And it just, it gives us that rich student data that helps institutions meet their goals. But then also, ultimately, it helps our students meet their learning goals too. All right, so we're going to take a look at some of the dashboards that you may encounter with these different types of courseware tools. We're just going to, pause on this for a moment, right? And think through, as you look through this one example of a dashboard, what is some of the information, that you could be gleaning from these dashboards? Oh, right when we're getting to your examples, Theo, I'm sorry, but the recording will be available so you can listen in on this piece here. So like if we think about the content that may be incorporated into our courses by way of courseware, we could have reading assignments interspersed with video, interactive elements, conceptual questions that help students understand the material better, gives additional information and instructions regarding, where our students need additional guidance. So if we're looking at this dashboard here, we see, how many learners have completed the assessment or the assignment? 100%, right? So that's great. Everybody's done the work that they need to do. And looking at how long we're anticipating our students are going to take to learn the concept. The dashboard's giving us an estimate. It's saying, okay, it should take between 40 to 59 minutes. And you'll see here that students are actually in the 51-minute range. So we're right at average, right? And how are learners aware of their own learning? It's giving like a strong indicator that they're moving toward the strong end of metacognition. But there's 31 of 33 concepts that are challenging, right? That's a striking number, right? 31 of 33 concepts that are very challenging. That would cue me as an instructor to think about my content, right? How am I approaching the content? What are the different pieces that I need to be thinking about that might make the learning experience a little more smooth, right? And if we look on the next slide. So these are other data pieces that we could be collecting. So, and our students will have visibility into a number of these as well, right? So these are faculty facing dashboards, but students will also have a student facing dashboard. And that student facing dashboard is going to give that student information very much the same as what you're receiving around their learning experience and how well they're doing and what are the concepts that they need to be looking at. So on our end, we see the most challenging objectives. We see, the assignments that have been completed to date. We also see frequently missed questions. So that's giving us that course information. But then from the student perspective, they're seeing that same information, right? So they know if they're missing certain concepts over and over again, that they need to be spending time, right? So what are we getting out of this information from a faculty perspective, right? How can faculty use these dashboards then to design and adapt your course materials and assignments to meet student needs? And I'll just stop there and I'll open the floor, as you're looking through these dashboard pieces. Let's see, I'll check the chat. Have any of you used a dashboard similar to this already?
So Tanya, one of the things that always
Yeah.
jumps out the page at me with dashboards is it really takes the guesswork out of it. You
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, this idea that this has need to go with our gut or what we think or believe rather than what the data is actually telling us, right? Where we end up focusing time with our students on maybe something they don't need us to spend extra time on, or maybe there was some reteaching or some supplemental instruction that needed to take place that we might have overlooked because we didn't have the specifics. And I love the idea of this where the courseware dashboards can really provide us the pinpoint accuracy on where we need to spend or we might need to spend additional time with all of our students or maybe just some of our students, right? So
exactly,
that resonates with me every time I see a new dashboard.
Yeah, it helps inform our teaching, make us more effective instructors in the end, right? Do you feel like this is something that you'd be interested in pursuing, thinking through, seeing these dashboards? Okay, so David says, nice dashboards, but if your course software doesn't have this type of dashboard available, how do people adjust? That's a really interesting question. Maybe you can unmute and I'd like to dig in a little bit more what you mean by adjust.
Well, as I said, we used to have something like that.
Yes.
But as we've gone through iterations of a textbook and the software that comes with it and the materials that all come with it, which were wonderful materials, that particular piece has gone away. So if you don't have a dashboard, we take our entire freshman class and push them into this course, but we don't have a dashboard anymore. So we don't have this kind of analysis.
Yeah.
So I approach it by breaking assignments into small pieces and having group discussions and having non-graded feedback on the initial pieces. And then going forward, looking at what the students do on the quizzes that came with the current textbook. But there's no dashboard that goes with any of this.
Yeah, that's tough, especially when you had the tool and now you don't have the tool now and it exists, and it's actually helpful to have that. And I think you're actually making the case for dashboards and analytics, David, because you've had that experience where you've had it and now you don't have it, and you're finding that gap there where that information was really critical and important to you.
On a different tact with that, in my public relations, one of my public relations classes, I did analytics early on at my first school because the pedagogy wasn't working.
Yeah.
And so what I have now is a slide from the first days of teaching a specific class where 48% of the students failed. And for me, that wasn't acceptable. I don't care how well prepared the students were, and it wasn't an intro course. 48% failure rate was just insane. But what has happened as the teaching methodology has evolved is I now throw up a slide on the screen that shows, well, but now I only have about 4% fail, and I can tell you exactly why and how. They have to turn in their homework or they don't pass the class. You do the work or you don't pass the class. But it makes it very, very stark for the students to understand, look at these statistics right here on the screen, which one you want to be in. This is why we're doing it this way.
Yeah. And just the other side of the coin to what you just said, which I think is really compelling from an instructor's vantage point, if I see students are not turning in the homework or they're not turning in the work, I'm going to ask why, right? I'm going to ask myself, okay, I see 30% of my students are not turning in this work. Why? There's a problem here, right? So how can I adjust my teaching so that students are more inclined to turn in that work, right? So it's two edges of, it's two sides of the same coin, right? So students have visibility into, hey, I know if I'm not turning in my work, I'm going to get this grade. But then from a faculty perspective, I'm going to ask why they're not turning it in. So great. I love that example. Thank you, David. Turning it over to you, Trent.
Yeah, so as we think about as we're in the short rows of of our session together, we started with this question of how does high quality courseware provide data and insights foundational to improving instruction? So what I'd like you to do is just to reflect on the question that's on the slide, and jot down into your own notes, right? We can improve instruction using data from high quality courseware in order to blank, right? So just a sentence stem or a sentence frame, just bullet as many ideas as you can think of. Feel free to drop those into the chat. And we'll use some of that reflection as we transition into our take action.
Yeah, so as you're thinking through, I'm sorry, I keep getting feedback, I apologize. Think through, as we, come to the end of our session today, how does this information change the way you think about designing gateway courses? Or all courses, really, honestly. And what is one thing that you could do in your course right now as your take action goal based on what we learned here today? And we have a Google Doc that was just dropped in the chat there. You can go ahead and populate that. I'm sorry, Trent, you were saying something. I apologize.
No apology needed, partner.
Okay.
I was just going to call out that Google Doc was in the chat as you were rocking and rolling.
Thank you. And as you're populating that Google Doc there, we can reflect on, what we learned today. And I know I'm inspired by all of your ideas. This conversation and your engagement has been so inspirational to me. I'm so excited to hear how this work is going, the things that you're learning. And I'm just going to take a moment. We'll take a moment to just, oh, great. Thank you. We have that Google Doc up there already. Yep. I love it. We're going to check out Blackboard. Yep. And that's a great point. Some of our LMSs already have some analytics that are built into those systems. Sometimes our institution just needs to flip the switch so that we have access to it. Great. And as you're populating this Google Doc, also think about what are some of the evidence-based teaching practices that you're most interested in adopting and implementing, and feel free to add that to that Google Doc too. Learning analytics in Canvas, yep. Yeah, certainly if you have access to those features in your LMS, you should certainly avail yourself of what's available. Great, please keep the ideas coming. Wonderful. And we're nearing the end of our time, and I want to make sure that we give you an opportunity to provide feedback to us as well. We have the survey link that'll be made available to you. And I want to make sure, yep, as you're completing these reflections and the Google Doc, there's a survey link. We use the information you provide us to consistently iterate on these sessions so that we're meeting your needs. And we'll have our next session next week. We're already in February. I cannot believe it that we're already in February. And I want to introduce you to your two facilitators that will be taking you to the next case making session, and that's Rwanda and Ray. If you wouldn't mind unmuting to introduce yourselves.
Of course. Thank you, Tanya and Trent. Wonderful session. I am Dr. Rwanda Garth McCullough for those who I haven't met yet, and looking forward to walking and continuing these conversations in our future sessions and working alongside Ray Keith.
I'm Ray Keith. I'm program consultant at ATD and look forward to working with you all on our next sessions and really excited about what we're going to learn together next session, next week.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome.
And maybe we can pull that Google Doc back up just to see our progress. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, please do keep populating the Google Doc, and you'll be able to access all of the documents that we referred to today in the LMS like we showed you, and the Google Doc will also be incorporated there. So if you come up with additional ideas and thoughts around that, please do populate that. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your time and look forward to engaging with you again.